Hello and welcome to another LightWave 3D Network Render Controller testing video. Today's topic will cover the new release of 2020.0.3 and how the Network Render Controller works in a production environment. I'm going to test three key areas of the software. The first test will be looking at the NRC interface and reviewing how it allows you to sort the nodes that are in your render environment. The second test will be looking at the NRC interface and how it handles multiple nodes being used on multiple scene files. And finally, the last test will be how the NRC software handles node failures. This includes service failures and new nodes coming online and being added to the queue. Now, this last item has been an issue since version 2019 that's prevented this tool from being used in a production environment because it's been unstable. I suspect that's still the case here since I haven't seen any fixes relayed to us in the release notes provided by Vizrt in recent versions. So let's look at the first test. I've loaded a few different nodes here from our environment that have the new render software installed on it. And you can see that the nodes are listed here in order of the node ID names. And if I click on the column header, you will see that it resorts based on the names. So A to Z and then Z to A. And this is handy when you have a naming structure for all of your nodes on the network. So for the second test, I'm going to take all of the nodes and assign them to all of the scene files that have been previously loaded in here. I'm going to select all of the nodes and start them. So you'll see they'll be loading the different scene files and starting to complete the frames. And this should only take about a minute or so for all of this to finish. We start to see frames over here being saved to the network. So one thing I am noticing is that some of these nodes have finished their task, but they weren't then assigned to the next available scene. So that's interesting. That may take a little bit more research to find out what's going on. So this looks like it's maybe limited success. Normally we'd want to have all the nodes be assigned to all of the scene files. And if that was the case, these scenes would have completed very quickly. At the end of this render, there should be 51 frames, which I believe there are. Though technically a success, there is some oddities where some of the nodes didn't get transitioned to the newer scene files. But I know that under the right conditions, this is going to work and we will not have those particular issues. Before I get to the third and final test for today, I'm going to right-click and remove these from the Network Render Controller. As it did before, it crashed. So that's not good if you want to work with the Network Render Controller in the middle of other scenes being rendered. If it's not stable, you may want to wait for all of the scenes to render and then use it again. I'm going to load it back up and get the scene file for the next test. For the third and final test, I'm going to add one of my nodes to the scene file. What's going to happen here is that I will start the rendering process and then stop the service on that render node. And this simulates either the service going offline or the computer restarting for some reason, or even loss in network connectivity. But it means that the node no longer communicates with the NRC controller here. And in the past, in this version and in 2019, that's caused this to crash. I'm going to click Start Node. It's going to start rendering frames. And while it's doing that, I'm going to then add a second one that should pick up the scene file and start rendering along with node 04. So while this happens, we have node 4 that's now going to go offline, simulating network outage, the service stopping in this case, or even the computer restarting because of updates. It should release assets, which it did, and not cause it to crash. So that's successful. That's a good sign. Didn't always do this, so we're going to see what happens when we bring node 4 back online. So the service restarts, then what happens? Okay, so the Network Render Controller sees it now. If I take it and add it back to the scene file, what happens? I'm going to stop node 0, 0. We're going to add node 10. So this behavior is something typical that I've seen in 2019 and previous editions of 2020. And that is when you're working with any of the nodes in the NRC interface here, while it's rendering, it often causes the application to crash, which it has here. It goes into this not responding phase, and unfortunately you can't do anything except close out the software, close the program, and start over. So I've loaded the NRC back up again, and I've added that scene file back to the queue. I'm going to select a number of different nodes and add them to the scene file and start them rendering again. Then I'm going to add node 4 to the list. It should initialize and start rendering along with the other 3 nodes. And it has. If I need to take this one offline, I can hit stop node. Are you sure? I'm going to hit stop. I'm going to resort. Looks like that's working still within a rendering environment while it's in process. If I go to 4 and add it back, it should initialize and pick up the scene file and start rendering at the next frame. Which it does. At this point, I simulate a network issue with the network render controller node. Stop the service. Either the network went out, the computer rebooted, or the service had an issue on that particular node. Looks like the other frames are still going. Node 4 comes back online, picks it up. I can still sort. Select node 4, add it to the queue. And rendering. All right, so far this particular part of the test is working. Normally you wouldn't do this much activity on a particular scene file with so many nodes, but again, this is just a test to see different scenarios in which you're having to manage the nodes manually on the network interface here. So note to self, anyone out there trying to use this, obviously you see it goes into the not responding phase. Once you have it rendering, don't touch it. And if any of your nodes go down, just wait till it finishes. So again, this just proves to me that the software hasn't been fixed and is still an issue. Hopefully Vizrt is able to provide some updates in a 0.4 release. We're not holding our breath on that. If you would like to use the network render controller in a stable method, this is my recommendation. Don't use the render controller from 2019 or 2020. So now I've loaded the network render controller from LightWave 2018. The downside of this software is it doesn't have the functionality to sort the nodes. That's kind of a bummer, but at the end of the day, if I want a stable render in my network render controller, this is the application I use. I've loaded the same scene file into this queue, and I'm going to take a handful of nodes and add them to that particular scene. This process is the same in 2019 and 2020. Multiple nodes were running on a scene. The second downside of 2018 is that it doesn't transition nicely between one scene and the next. So if you have a queue that has 5 different scene files and you want to use all of your nodes on all of them, it's not going to transition all the nodes to the next scene and complete it. So it's kind of a hassle. If you have really long renders, that's not that big of a deal because you can have all your nodes working on one scene like this. I'm going to add 4 to this queue. it's going to pick up the scene file and start rendering. At this point, I'm going to simulate the network outage or the service failure of the node itself. 2018 says it's unavailable and removes it from the list. Node 4 comes back online, shows up in the list, and then you can add it back to the queue and it'll pick up rendering. So in 2018, no matter what I do to the nodes, I could take all of them offline for a bit, except one. You want to leave one rendering. But 2018 did not fail. It's always been stable in this. That's the recommendation if you need to use the network render controller and have access to LightWave 2018. And even if you don't, if you're able to get the 2018 software, you don't necessarily need the license that goes with it. Just install the network render controller side of it. And that's all you have to use. And it'll work just fine. I can even stop the nodes directly here in the interface, and it's not going to blink an eye. I can add the other ones. So granted, not all the functionality of a 2019 render controller or 2020 is here, but the stability is. And at the end of the day, that's what counts when you're trying to get a lot of scene files rendered out with the minimal amount of administration. To summarize, version 2020.0.3 still has some errors in the network render controller where it causes it to crash. And if those get solved by the Vizrt team, then you can safely upgrade to 2020 if you use this functionality. But until that time, you can see that 2018 works really well. And I can't wait for updates to happen where these errors in 2020 are resolved and it becomes stable again. So thanks and have a great day.